All right, so we have today Dr. Peter Sims, lecturer in economics at the University of Surrey, and we're going to hear a talk about political and historical IF games. I'm really looking forward to it. I've played like half of the games you mentioned and have heard of the other half, so this is something to be really interesting.
All right, thank you, Flo. Great honor and pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to Flo and Des and Carleen for making this all happen and keeping it going. I've been attending this meetup since I think it ever existed, but this is the first time I've gotten a chance to actually speak about a genre which is near and dear to my heart, and which is surprisingly or maybe even shockingly tiny, especially until relatively recently, that I think is a really great use case for interactivity that really brings out the point, the meaning of video games or interactive fiction as a genre, the ability to respond meaningfully to players' choices and shape the narrative. But until, again, relatively recently, this was almost an empty genre, and there are a few reasons for that. I'm going to be talking today about what I think of as the historical progenitor of this genre. I'll be talking about some more recent examples. I'll be dealing in depth with 5 games. I listed 6. I had to drop Orwell. I don't have time to talk about it. If anybody wants to talk about the recent adaptation of Orwell's Animal Farm, happy to talk at the pub, but I will be going through 5 examples from this genre and the ways in which their mechanics and their narratives speak to the possibilities of representing politics in interactive fiction, and the ways in which our historical knowledge and experience sort of allows us to play these games and to understand them, and then to take the lessons or ideas from them back into the world. I don't mean to say you can get an education in political science or political economy by playing video games. We're not quite there yet. But there are some things that this genre does that I actually find really challenging in my day job as a lecturer, to get students to understand what it is like to be in a political decision-making seat, and why this is not a trivial game, why you don't just always pick the best option, why this wasn't solved a zillion years ago, why we are not, at the end of history or whatever, to beat up on Fukuyama again for no reason. History keeps happening, politics keeps happening, and the one thing almost everyone everywhere seems to be able to agree on is that politicians are idiots and they're getting it wrong. Which is really interesting, because we've been playing that game since the beginning of civilization. You'd think we'd have gotten it right. This genre allows us to get at a little bit of why that might be more complicated. So, when I say genre, what do I mean? Well, I really loved James Portnoy's definition of genre. It's certainly not the only one, but what really defines a genre is about the emotional reaction it is trying to elicit from the audience, or in this case, the player. And if you elicit a different kind of emotional reaction, you're probably in a different genre. And what we have here is a genre that is trying to create that sort of tense uncertainty of a difficult choice, where you don't know what the outcome is going to be. You have some sense that these choices are important, you know what you want, but nevertheless, it is not obvious what choice to make. And not all game decisions do that. For instance, there's a kind of system in games like, let's say, like Mass Effect. You're going to be a paragon or a renegade, the good guy or the bad guy. You are at no point making a tense decision under uncertainty about whether you want to take this path or that path. It's a kind of character choice, and it is a choice, and it does affect the narrative, but nobody is wondering, oh, am I really serving the greater good by picking the Paragon path? Should I actually pick the Renegade path in order to... there are a couple of decisions you might be able to make that sort of argument, but generally not. That's actually a fairly obvious decision. It doesn't create an interesting or complex narrative. This genre is almost defined by those interesting, complex narratives. So I've tried to be thorough about this. This is a sort of restrictive core definition of what I mean by political interactive fiction. Some games violate one of these rules in small ways, although I don't think any game in this genre violates any of these rules in large ways. Political interactive fiction is about making specific, contextualized, and sequential choices. That is to say, you are not just adjusting a slider or making an abstract decision. You're doing something specific. You're saying something to someone. You're implementing a particular policy at a particular time. You're making one choice and not another. They're contextualized in the sense that they are part of a larger narrative, which itself is part of a larger world that you understand and can use that information to make that choice. It's sequential. The choices happen one after the other, no take-backsies. You can't just redo your choices at random or whenever you want. They come one after the other in a way that matters. It's from the perspective of a character. That is to say, you are not... There is a player character, and they are a entity in the world, probably a human being, or a person or agent. They are not the sort of abstract perspective of some god emperor or the embodiment of a civilization or something like that. It's a narrative about power. That is to say, it's a narrative, it's a story, it has a plot and a sequence, and it's about power. In some way, this is about how we affect the world, how you make decisions to achieve objectives, and other people make decisions in the same way, and those things come together and interact. It is deterministic. That is to say, this is not a game that incorporates randomness. All of these games are at least plausibly deterministic in all cases. There's one game where you can turn on some degree of randomness, but not a lot. And this is important, because if this becomes a very gambling kind of game, it might be interesting, but it feels different. It changes the emotional reaction. Because the reason why something happens is not just what you did, it's the dice roll, and that feels very different. The underlying model is opaque. That is to say, this is not all the gears are revealed to you simulation where you can see all the pieces moving. What your choices affect things in the world, but you don't necessarily know how. You can't see, it's not chess. All the information is not revealed to you. You can't strategize in that way, and the outcome is uncertain, partly because of the opacity of the world model. If you don't have those things, you're probably in a different genre. But those things together create a particular kind of experience, and one that I find very compelling and very interesting, and again, underexplored. Shockingly few entries. So, political here means making choices about power, and in this case, making difficult choices about power. And you have to be thinking about, what is it that you want? What is it that you are able to do? What is your motive? What are your tools? What do other agents want, and what are their tools? How will your decisions affect them, and how will their decisions affect you? Do you want to be pragmatic or idealistic? Do you pursue your goals ruthlessly or directly? What ends or means justify each other? You might have multiple goals. What are you willing to sacrifice to accomplish what at the end of the day? If you want to do 2 or 3 or 10 things, then if you can't accomplish all 10, which is the first one to go? And if you try to accomplish 10 things, do you end up accomplishing none of them? So these are all the kinds of questions that don't tend to come up all that often in other genres in the same way. There are definitely games that bring these ideas forward, but most narrative games don't. Simulationist games do in a different way, but I'll get to those in a second. So what this leads to is complex choices and consequences. Plenty of games have choices and consequences. And one of the things I actually liked about the eponymous choice of games is that they actually do get to some of this complexity. Your choices are not just obvious. They're not just Paragon Renegade. You obviously pick the same choice over and over again. And even a game as sophisticated as Disco Elysium, for instance, suffers a bit from this. If you want to play as a communist character, you probably pick the communist dialogue option many, many times. There are no circumstances, or extremely few circumstances, where in order to be the best communist character or attain communist objectives, you actually pick something else. It's a role-playing decision, but it's not really a complex decision that you have to think about in terms of what are your goals and how do I get there. These should have conflicting goals in the sense that there should be many things you might want to accomplish, and you can't accomplish them all at once. And you have to ask, what can I do versus what do I want to do? There should be binding constraints of some kind. You have limited resources. You do not determine the world in a totally free sandbox way. There should be opportunity costs. That is to say, doing one thing means you didn't do something else, and that will matter. You should feel like your decisions are impactful, partly because they involved giving up something that you also wanted. And that makes decisions tense and difficult. And there should be some engagement with instrumentalism. Because this is a game about politics, your objectives are one thing, that's great. But then the question of, well, what about power for its own sake? Because one path to achieving at least a great many things is accumulate a whole bunch of power and then do whatever you want. But of course that itself comes at a kind of cost. Accumulating power changes things. It changes people, it changes you, it changes the system, and maybe you wanted to accomplish some things early and you didn't do those things because you were accumulating power to use later. Do you be ruthless or do you be idealistic? Or, on the other hand, if you try to be maximally idealistic and always pursue those things you think are good or best in the short run, you may find yourself without power, which means you are unable to affect things later on, and that might have very serious costs. So those are the kinds of decisions that I think define this genre. I think about these as medium-length games. Playthroughs of these games are usually between 2 and 10 hours, seldom much more or less than that. And the reason for that, well, there's several reasons for that, but mostly it's that they're short enough to be replayed. There is some kind of concept that this is a game where you might want to take multiple paths through it or explore the space in more than one narrative run-through. You don't just learn the story and then we're done. Sometimes this is implicit. The game doesn't tell you you're supposed to replay this, you just might want to. You played through a run of Suzerain and decided, oh, that was cool, but what if I made these other choices? And so you think, I should play it again. Neat. Other times it's explicit. There are games on this list that involve baked-in mechanics about things like reincarnation or time loops in more fantastic settings that tell you, like, this game is explicitly designed to be replayed. Once one playthrough is done, you should start another playthrough. That's part of the game. And this distinguishes it from at least some kinds of narratives. The important thing is not the plot in one dimension. The important thing is the possibility spaces in multiple dimensions. You have many choices that will take you through this same general narrative, but with variations that are interesting and relevant. And exploring those is part of the point of this genre. Sorry, John Ingold, these are games that are designed to be replayed. They tell you that. The game also has to be long enough for the emergence of uncertainty. Remember, I've told you that these are deterministic games. And deterministic games that are extremely short are too transparent. It's too easy to see how your choices led to the objectives, and we start to lose the sense of uncertainty and end up in the sort of Paragon Renegade choice, right? If you have a political game of one choice, do a right-wing thing or do a left-wing thing, and if you take the right-wing thing, you get the right-wing ending, and you do the left-wing thing, you get the left-wing ending. You made a choice, it's about politics, but there's no uncertainty, it's not interesting, it's not replayable, it's trivial. Because you can just tell exactly what it is created, the outcome, too easily. The game needs to be long enough that the sum of your deterministic choices starts to get you lost in the forest. There needs to be uncertainty about, did I do the right things or not? Was I too meek? Was I too bold? Did I burn the wrong bridges? Did I make the wrong allies? those are the kinds of questions that can only occur if you're making enough decisions and those choices are complex enough. Choices should affect multiple variables, at least sometimes. That is to say, it's not just a matter of you only ever make a choice that changes one thing in the world. And the outcome should be the result of many choices, not just one, with some exceptions. The big red button is in front of you, you push it, kaboom, yeah, okay, that changed the world. But in general, you will be making cumulative choices that transform the world collectively, but no single choice is what makes it all happen. These are almost always some kind of three-act play. Some of them have more explicit divisions than that, but there is almost invariably some kind of prologue or act one that allows you to establish who you are. You make decisions that align you with one ideology or path or personality. Then there is a middle section in which you make a whole series of critical choices in order to forward those objectives that you have sort of defined in Act 1, including going against them and betraying them and doing something else. And then there is some kind of Act 3 where the consequences happen, where what your choices then pay off into endings and things that are of interest. So why do I like this genre so much? Well, to some extent, it's about my day job. Historians talk about context, and historians talk about contingency. And you can annoy the overwhelming majority of historians by talking about events as though they are mechanically predetermined. Historians really solidly emphasize that choice and human agency plays a role in history. The difficulty, of course, is there is only one history, and we don't get to do it twice. So if somebody says, no, it was all predetermined, philosophically, there isn't any way to contradict that exactly. Something quantum mechanics, it's all very complicated, but if we want to think about why questions, causal questions, we need some idea that it could have been different, and if it had been different, something would have changed. That means we need some kind of idea of the world, and you need counterfactuals, that is to say, a world that didn't exist but might have existed, because otherwise the idea of contingency is just meaningless. What do you mean things would have been different, but you refuse to specify in any way, shape, or form how? Like, that doesn't get us anywhere. So if we want to talk about this, or I guess to summarize the social sciences and history problem, if you want to think about causality and the consequence of different choices, you need some kind of underlying world model. And that there's no such thing as a perfect world model. We do not have it. It is not in existence. Neither historians nor economists nor anyone else can provide you with the model. It works like that. We don't even have particularly good options. And if you want to create choice, you need to have some kind of model. All of these games do have a model like that. It is almost always quite a qualitative, kludgy model, where things like what your ideology is are tracked with some kind of counter. Do you have 1 communism points or do you have 10 communism points? But they don't show you that. That's under the hood. That's part of the underlying mechanism of the game. This is also a problem for historical fiction. Indeed, the whole concept of historical fiction is sort of a contradiction in terms, right? If history is about what happened, and fiction is about things that didn't happen, sort of a big question mark. But the reason historical fiction works is because we can use broad historical context that we keep the same, and then insert a little fictional bubble that interacts with that. A character who's not a real person, who didn't exist, but who might interact with this kind of world and its values and its constraints and whatnot, and they make different choices, or they make some choices, and you use the interaction between those two things to tell us something interesting. And I think that's legitimate, but it also means you have to have some kind of underlying concept about the world. And it's also the case that you can create a game with the illusion of choice. Clementine will remember that. You know, the Walking Dead. That creates a different genre, in that your choices feel tense and they matter, but it's not replayable. The possibility space becomes very uninteresting very quickly. Replaying games like that, you very rapidly see the man behind the curtain, and that is not what I am talking about. There's also another direction here, which is simulationism. And lots of games are in this genre, which might be part of the reason why political IF is as underdeveloped as it is, or at least as sparsely populated as it is. That this genre is so, or these genres are so famous, popular, best-selling, and you know, this starts, maybe that's wrong, it doesn't start with, but you get games like Chris Crawford's Balance of Power from 89, I think, where, you know, the Cold War is modeled, and that's you play as one of the superpowers, and you have to balance all of the tense brinkmanship. You know, do you conduct a coup? It plays like a game of Twilight Struggle or something, or Sid Meier's Civilization, where it models this world-building concept, but from the perspective, effectively, of a board game. Sid Meier's Civilization is not a narrative. It's not really a story. It is a set of rules. You are not a person. I mean, you give yourself a name or whatever, but apparently you lived for like 7,000 years, so you're not a real person. And politics is sort of abstracted away. Political constraints are not a part of civilization. That's not how that goes. I mean, they model things like unrest, but in a very kludgy way that does not really fit with a story. These are all simulationist. Paradox games, which do a fabulous job of adding historical detail to replay counterfactuals, but in a totally different way. Things like Crusader Kings, Hearts of Iron, and so on. The old Koei games, the Nobunaga's Ambition, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and my personal bête noire, Democracy, which is this set of games where you govern a country by setting policies, and those policies have effects, and then that changes all the sliders, and all sorts of weird results happen. These games are wildly popular by the standards of this genre. They're also horrifyingly broken. You end up with weird situations like where 100% of your population are socialist farmers who work for the government. It's like, what? This does not replicate the tension of political choice at all. You make political choices, but it does not have that narrative quality that I am looking at. There are also a few near neighbors here that I'm not going to talk about today, but might be of interest to people who are interested in this sort of game. King of Dragon Pass, or Six Ages, is very similar, but it includes randomness, and you are not a specific person. And those two things change a shockingly large amount. They play and feel very differently. There are games where politics is involved, but you sort of observe it rather than sit in the decision-maker's chair. Games like 80 Days, or Mind Forever Voyaging, or Citizen Sleeper, which have very strong political themes, or indeed Disco Elysium, but you're not the political decision-maker. That's not what the game is about. The game is not about making those trade-offs. And there is a set of games here that I call cog in the machine games. That's a very recent type of genre, I think, but where you play some more minor role, and you do make political decisions, but within the sort of, from within the belly of some kind of beast. I could probably do a separate talk about those. I'm not talking about them, but they are conceivably quite interesting. Papers, Please is a legend. Games like NeoCab. What does it mean to make a decision as an ordinary person? History is our primary guide to understanding these games. And I don't mean like the nitty-gritty details of history, but the broad sense of how history goes. Yeah, this apocryphal quote that Mark Twain almost certainly didn't say, but people have been bandying around, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. There's this idea that you can find historical patterns that are useful, interesting, you can relate to them. There are countries that have gone like this before, how do we think this is going to go now? A legitimate, if somewhat fuzzy, kind of reasoning, and this allows you to create, effectively, new sort of poetry, right? You can take this sort of way in which this story has gone in the past and multiple examples of it and use that to craft plausible new stories that aren't real but feel real. They're resonant. And that's the next slide. Legendary game designer Mark Rosewater, lead designer of Magic the Gathering for most of my lifetime, defines this idea of resonance, that for him is a really core part of what makes a lot of games and a lot of mechanics work well. And this is the idea that when you build a game component using an idea the audience is already familiar with from the rest of their world. And he gives the classic example of the mechanic of flying in Magic the Gathering. I don't know what people think flying is in the real world. It's certainly not, this creature cannot be blocked by creatures without flying. That's not what flying is. That's not what birds and planes do. But nevertheless, when you tell people that this creature has flying in Magic, people know what that means. They just know it intuitively, because flying is a thing in the real world. And political history functions similarly here. If you talk about raising taxes or declaring war or a coup d'etat, people know what those things are because they have real-world analogies. And it's one of the things that this genre relies very heavily on. Politics is incomprehensible if you don't have that kind of contextual knowledge, and boy is it hard to give people that kind of contextual knowledge. So, on slide 13, for the first time, we mentioned some actual games in this genre, of which I'll be talking about 5. One I dropped late in the day because my talks are incredibly long, the other because I just haven't played it for reasons that I don't entirely comprehend. But this is a spectrum of realism in this genre. And we go all the way from this game here, Crisis in the Kremlin, which was a 1990 or 91 game, one of the earliest progenitors, where you play as Mikhail Gorbachev, and you are basically put in charge of the Soviet Union in the last days of the Soviet Union, and what do? Do you reform? Do you crack down? Do you do what he did? Do you do radically different things? This is counterfactual history very directly. You're playing a real person in a real situation. The only thing that changes is what you decide and how the world model then says things would have gone. So that's the maximum. And past this point, and that says past here, we don't have choices. If you were to be more historically realistic than that, you would have to say, oh no, there's only one Mikhail Gorbachev and he did these things. We don't know what would have happened if he did different things, and that's not an interactive game. So that, I think, represents a sort of maximum on that side. We can then go all the way through all these games that I will talk about, all the way to Long Live the Queen, which is a delightful game I'll talk about in more detail. This is a game where you play as like a magical princess who is going to become queen very soon, who must navigate the political difficulties of her magical medieval-ish kingdom. But like, to be clear, there are options in this game to like vaporize people with magical spells. That is not a real thing that actual human beings can do. There is no world, no country of Nova cities. This world does not exist. But there are still some historical analogies. We know what a queen or a princess is. We know what their childhood might have been like. We know what kind of decisions they might have made. When they raise taxes, it still means the same thing as when we raise taxes. We can map it on close enough, but if we go too far past here, we start to lose context. If we have a world where taxes don't exist and resources are accumulated in some totally different way, we lose the historical understanding of what that might mean, which might be fine, but we're now in some different genre. And every point along this way is populated by at least some games, and I'll talk about how as we get there. So, the long prologue finished. I'm going to do this talk in 2 parts, talk about 5 games. First part, we're talking about what I think are the 2 big bookend games in this genre. And it tells you something about how sparse it is that is the case. That between 1988 and 2020, there aren't a lot of super big landmark games here. I could be mistaken, I could be missing some. That's definitely possible. Lots of weird niche games I've not heard of, or maybe even some big ones. But I think in 1988, we have the genre codifier, the game that sets up what this genre is and does it shockingly well for 1988. And then we have a recent game released in 2020 called Suzerain, that is the best recent example of this genre, that if I could recommend a game, you like this genre, you want to play the core playable entry, do that one. Hidden Agenda you could totally play, but you need DOSBox. It's old. So the first game I'm going to go into some detail on is Hidden Agenda. And note the lovely 80s edutainment style. I'm so happy that someone decided to make this. A Hidden Agenda, a post-revolutionary game. That's exactly what it is. And it's designed and written mostly by Jim Gasparini. The credits are there. He didn't do literally everything, but it's his brainchild. It's his baby. And this is a game with what at the time was, I think, quite a novel idea, that you play as the newly elected head of a small Latin American state. We'll get to the which state in a moment, excuse me. And you are the head of a super unstable coalition government after the overthrow of a universally unpopular and incompetent dictator. Someone modeled, his name is Farsante, which should probably tell you everything you need to know about this guy. Sort of a pastiche of Baby Doc Duvalier, Fulgencio Batista, other dictators that did so badly that even their superpower patrons abandoned them and their governments collapsed. And your player character is a cipher. You give them a name, they are a person, and it's very important that they're a person. Notably, you can be killed, so it's very important. You are not civilization style, the eternal god emperor of this country. If you die, that's it. That's your story. It's over. You're dead. But you do get to shape at least who you are and what you do. You answer some initial responses to press questions. The game, of course, records that. Are you someone who is trying to ensure material prosperity, or protect human rights, or eliminate corruption? What are your goals here? What do you publicly declare that you are going to do? And of course, everyone is listening. Everyone is paying attention to what you say. Your enemies, your allies, everyone. This takes place in a country called Chimerica, which is not, of course, a real country. Its capital is Poye, which is a hilarious joke if you're a Latin American economic historian, and not so hilarious if you're anyone else. And Jim Gasparini wrote a fabulous essay that actually is in the instruction manual for this game, and I think captures a lot of the heart of the genre, the philosophy of it, really well. He's clearly a very thoughtful person who took this seriously. He says this is a chimera of a country, has the body of El Salvador, the neck of Nicaragua, the claws of Cuba, the head of Haiti. This is a country which is none of these countries, but in some sense it's all of these countries. Its experiences are generalizable. It looks a lot like these countries. Its history rhymes with these countries in the previous analogy. But the rest of the world is all intact. Chimerica does not exist, but you do live in a world where there is a Soviet Union and a US and a Cuba and a Mexico. Those are all there and they occupy about the same position you'd expect. And he says, the reason they did this, and I think this is really critical and insightful, if we had attempted to model Guatemala, the game would have had to incorporate both the way it happened and various what-ifs, depending on the choices players made. Our Guatemala would soon have been as imaginary as our Chimerica. That is to say, and this is Crisis of the Kremlin, right? You're the Soviet Union, you're Mikhail Gorbachev, but the moment you make a different decision, or frankly, even the moment you don't make a different decision, because the world model is not the model of the real world, you're talking about something fictional. You're writing a counterfactual history. And he acknowledges that and embraces that. It's also a game that more or less eschews the abstractions. It presents information to you really quite realistically. You have two main sources of direct information. You get dry government reports with graphs and charts. You can see how much foreign exchange you have, what infant mortality is, how many loans you owe, etc. That's the kind of information you would have if you were running a country like this, and you could trust your statistical agencies. And there's also newspapers. You can read foreign and domestic newspapers, and they all have their own ideological slant. If you read the American right-wing newspaper, no kidding, they're going to be really annoyed about your land redistribution program. And will talk very badly about it and how this is going to all go to hell. And it's a hard game. Maybe it will go to hell. But you get information, but only in the sort of plausible ways it would be presented in this world. You don't see under the hood. You don't see the sliders. You don't press the buttons. You make decisions in a way that makes it's more embodied, more contextual. So this is a country that is recently, there was a recent revolution. There are 3 big political parties. The Christian Reform Party, which was the tolerated party of Mickey Mouse dissent during Farsante, and the intelligentsia, the middle classes. They're harmless centrists. And then there's National Liberation, and they're the leftists. They're the ones who were involved in a decades-long revolutionary struggle, in the workplace, in the hills. They're guerrillas, they're student activists, and they are very happy for you to align yourself with the Soviets, with Cuba, with other revolutionary governments. And then there's Popular Stability, that are the latecomers to the revolution who abandoned Farsante when it became clear even the US didn't want him anymore. And they're the former army, they're the rich landowners, and so on. And you pick how you want to govern. You can pick your ministers from any of these parties, and you only get to pick policies if your minister is willing to suggest them. So if you pick a right-wing minister, you can't get them to implement super left-wing policies. And that makes a certain kind of sense. It's how these things do in fact work in the real world. And notably, your military is a mix of 2 very oil and water groups, the old revolutionary guerrillas who have been fighting in the hills, and their subcomandante, and clearly modeled on Marcos, and the professional military. These 2 do not super get along, and that means that your decisions have a certain kind of inherent uncertainty to them. If you say, no, the super left-wing revolutionary leader is now in charge, obey him, I mean, you can say that. The question is, what's going to happen? Do you have enough authority to make that happen? Does he have enough authority to make that happen? Do the people who you have now subordinated to him have enough authority to do something different? What will the Americans think? What will the Soviets think? Who knows? It's all very unclear, and that opacity, even though the choice is clear, you know what you could or couldn't do as a decision, the result is a mess. And that's important. It's important that the result not be obvious, because that's how real decisions are. Now, the way they organize this, it gets a little kludgy, but mostly it works. Rather than just making top-down decisions, you have encounters. You can select who it is you want to talk to and get their input on how you're governing. In this case, we have Plácido Dimas Hernández, who is the archbishop at the cathedral in Poye, and he is deeply involved in human rights. And if you go and talk to him, he will almost certainly say something along the lines of, "I'm really glad that you have imprisoned the leader of the death squads. Could you please make sure that this person gets a trial and ends up in prison as soon as possible?" Or ends up being sentenced as soon as possible. And if, for one reason or another, the leader of the resident death squads has been released from prison, either because you did it or someone else did it, or he escaped, he will almost certainly say, "Could you please put the leader of the death squads back in prison?" That's his role, that's his representation. He is part of one wing of the Catholic Church, here a sort of centrist, human rights-oriented wing, rather than the other wings, which are also represented in the game elsewhere. But you can have similar consultations with union leaders, with army generals, with the IMF representative, with the Cuban ambassador, whatever, and they will say, you should do something. And you can either say, yes, let's do that something, or no, I'd really rather not do that something. Both of those will affect not only the world state, but also what they think of you. And if you say absolutely not to someone who makes you an offer they think you can't refuse, that will change their view of you in the future. Possibly they simply won't talk to you anymore. And that might be very important if the person you're talking to is the representative of the IMF, and they are the ones who have money when you don't. But you make choices. And as you make choices, doors start to close. And this is one of the critical ways in which the mechanics and the narrative interact in this game. Those choices initially seem very broad. You have lots of possibilities. By the end of the game, you probably have far fewer possibilities. What you can do becomes a function of what you've done in the past. And there are also triggered events that happen, you do something, and there's some kind of reaction. I will, in general, do this entire presentation without serious spoilers for anything, because I want people to be able to play these games. But there is one decision you can make very early on in Hidden Agenda that I will spoil just because I think it's really indicative, where you will have what seems like a very harmless conversation with an owner of a small peasant farm that grows food. And he will say that the system of price fixing is absolutely doing us in. We are not able to make any money whatsoever. We're already very poor. Could you please lift the price cap? Because if you don't, we have no incentive to grow any more food, and food is scarce. Which seems like a very sensible argument at the time. And as an economist, I think in the long run, it probably is right. You don't want price caps on food. That's hazardous business. If you touch that price cap on food, until you have done a whole series of things to increase food production, you will have immediate riots. And you will have to reverse course overnight. Or you will be overthrown immediately. Tough luck. This is a hard game. You make the choice, you suffer the consequences. And of course, going back and forth on these choices is not well received by anyone. No one loves that you make this choice, you're like, oh wait, no, that was terrible, I'll do this other thing. Very rarely does that go well. So, what does Hidden Agenda say then about the world and about small Latin American countries in the 80s, many of which represent some version of this country, this fake Chimerica country? Well, it says, 1, interest groups act in ways that constrain your choices. You may be the president, you may make decisions, but that does not mean omnipotence. You are not the God Emperor civilization style. If you send everyone to their deaths, they just march to their deaths without question because that's how the mechanics work. No. The real world does not work this way, and neither does the game. If you don't have power, and you don't have popular support being a source of power, and sometimes power being a source of popular support, you can be killed, you can be overthrown, other people will take their chances. They are also playing this high-stakes game. If you alienate too many groups, you can end up powerless. If you alienate no groups, well, first off, good luck, but also you will probably end up powerless as well because you're not trying to do anything. Sitting back and passively watching events happen, also a terrible idea. And both your rivals and your subordinates will do things by themselves. They are also actors. And sometimes they will do things that you would really rather them not do, but you may not be able functionally to stop them. And what do you do then? And a lot of this mirrors the real history. First off, that this is a realm of high-stakes politics. That is to say, small Latin American countries in the 1980s were not in a situation where there were robust, functioning democracies, and if one political party is voted out of office, they just wait their turn for 4 or 8 years, and then they have their next kick at the can, and revise their policies and elect new leaders, and more or less everything's fine. If things go in the wrong direction, they will end up killed or exiled. Their political parties will be banned. They will hand over the tools of oppression to the people who hate them. And that will be true even if you try to be kind and moderate and reasonable. That doesn't mean that your opponents will be. They are also playing ruthless high-stakes games. There is absolutely no consensus. Everything will be unpopular with some people, and that will cause reactions, some of which may end your game, others of which may be merely inconvenient. And bridges get burned. And this is part of that sequential decision-making thing. What you do in moment 1 changes the toolkit for what you can do in moment 10. And you may think, I want to keep all my options open. That may not be possible. And one of the reasons is because both your enemies and your allies want to shape your choices down particular paths. And so they will do things that you can't stop them from doing, and that will then cause problems for you. Let's say you're playing as a center leftist who is trying to do nice things for people but also not piss off the Americans. You may find that some of your ministers, or perhaps the subcomandante who led that revolutionary struggle, goes and does something which really pisses off the Americans. And you wonder, why would he do that? Well, maybe he was trying to force you to make a difficult choice. And now you have a difficult choice. Do you throw him in prison, which will be a huge blow to your support, or do the Americans close down their embassy and we're out, no money, no technology, no support, no nothing? Hard choice. Why do you have to make that choice? Because he forced you to make it. So Hidden Agenda is ruthless in this way, and that models how this went in actual history. Jim Gasparini was very well aware of what at the time was current events, what is now history, of this region, and I think captures these dilemmas in a really compelling way. This was not an easy game, and lots of people played it as well as they could have, and it went very badly for a lot of people. In many ways a depressing game, but set up a possibility. You could make a game like this. A different sort of political game that represented people and political choices differently. And this idea was picked up. Hidden Agenda, I think, directly inspired Crisis in the Kremlin a couple of years later, but did not spawn an entire genre of these sorts of things for the next 20, 30 years. It just didn't. This became a historical curiosity. And if some tiny bits of this were picked up in different genres, nobody really, to my knowledge, took this concept and ran with it until Suzerain, which is, I still think of as recent. I guess it's 4 years old now. Put out by Torpor Games. They're based in Berlin, but they're mostly Turkish developers. The lead developer, a guy named Ata Sergey Nowak, decided we are going to give this a robust crack. And you can see the imprint of Hidden Agenda all over this. I cannot imagine that they were unaware of Hidden Agenda, although I haven't asked them. Maybe I should. But there are many, many, many elements of this that are reminiscent and improve on it. They also have an expansion, which is, I would say, about 80% as good as the base game that they recently released. Very cool, and quite successful. A game that I think has, in its own niche, really caught on. In Suzerain, you do not play as a cipher who you get to name. You play as this guy, Anton Rain, the newly elected president of Swordland. And somewhat similar situation to in Chimerica. You're the leader of a very nebulous big tent party that has lots of different elements in it, and you are not necessarily aligned with any one by default, which gives you some flexibility. He's canonically tall. He has a wife. Her name is Monica. He has 2 kids, Frank and Diana. So this is a person with relationships, friendships, an existing track record. But mostly you determine everything relevant about this person and his politics. And they have a prologue that allows you to set the key events in his life. What sort of a person was he? Choices that you make concerning your military service, how you rose through the ranks in politics, where you went to school, whether you were a family man or a political man. These are things you can determine about him, and then, of course, the rest of the game, you get to make whatever choices you want. This is a dialogue-driven game. This has even less abstraction than Hidden Agenda. You have this very, like, ink or twine style, like, here's some text, you get to respond to it. You make a choice, you get more text, you respond to that, and so on and so forth, and your game is a whole series, almost exclusively, of conversations. There are a few things that are dealt with by menus for various reasons, but mostly this is what you do. You have all the people in the room. In this case, you have your economic team, Gus Manger, Simon Hall, and Lilius Graff, and they walk you through the choices you can make. So, they're having an argument about what kinds of decisions you should make. Should you make pro-business decisions or pro-citizen decisions? And you can say, we need to heed the calls of our businesses in these days of recessions. Or you can say, the citizens and their demands matter the most, and so on and so forth. You respond to what they say, and they respond back. And what you say is, of course, important. It is also important how you say it. You can be, in many cases, blunt or rude or diplomatic. And, of course, to whom you say it. They are listening, and they are talking. And some people are very deeply influenced by what you say, others much less. So you have broad freedom to make all sorts of decisions, but people are always listening. Everything you choose or do affects the world state. And you make hundreds of individual choices. And many of them are non-trivial or unrelated. And of course, this leads to combinatorial explosion. You can't possibly model everything as a giant branching tree of hundreds of decisions. You end up with quadrillions of outcomes. Instead, you have one main narrative, and then they track relevant changes based on what you've chosen before. So there are things that will happen more or less no matter what you choose, unless you choose something utterly crazy. And in Suzerain, that's pretty hard. Suzerain's very forgiving in terms of the game doesn't end when you make choices until Act 3, more or less. Spoiler alert. But each time you change some variable, that then causes triggers for future events. And these future events almost never have just one cause. It's very rare that this thing in the future happened only because you made this decision, and no other. It's the sum total of lots of previous decisions you have made. Sometimes in an obvious way, sometimes in a not so obvious way. And this creates links between choices and consequences, but it is also uncertain because it is opaque. For instance, you say, I want to reform the healthcare system, and then 60 moves later or 60 decisions later, you're informed your healthcare reform failed miserably. I'm just making that up, but why? Did you not fund it enough? Did you piss off the wrong people? Did you make the wrong international allies? Hard to know. The game will give you some feedback, and it will be scrupulously fair in terms of you made a bunch of decisions that would have affected this, maybe try changing some of those, but you don't get to know. It doesn't tell you this because the following. It just tells you what happened. And that then keeps that sense. So, very much like Hidden Agenda, Swordland is the Chimerica, but for a 1950s developing country, a new fragile democracy. The model is clearly Turkey. Sergei Nowak will deny it and deny it and deny it. That's obviously wrong. It is obviously based on Turkey. I'll just tell you that. But it's not exclusively based on Turkey. It's based on the experiences of lots of countries in this period that were kind of like Turkey. And you have neighbors that have their own flavoring. They do a really cool job of scrambling historical cultural recipes. You have Agnolia, and Agnolia is very clearly the Netherlands. They're democratic, they're liberal, they're slightly small, they're a naval power, And there is Lesbia, and Lesbia is maybe Spain or Italy or maybe Mexico. They're super West-aligned, they're super capitalist, they're very rich. They're kind of a bunch of jerks, but, you know, it fits. There's Volksland over there, that they're very much socialists. There's something maybe East Germany or maybe Yugoslavia about them. Emmerich Hegel, their leader is very obviously Nikita Khrushchev, or a Nikita Khrushchev XP, and they're culturally Nordic. They're probably Danish in terms of how their cities are named and so on. So all this stuff rhymes very, 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 very intensely with the real world, but none of it is the real world. Everything has been renamed and redesigned, at least slightly. And you are in the Cold War. There's Arcasia, which is very obviously the US. They lead a treaty organization called the ATO, and their great Soviet rivals are the Kantana, that leads the Kantanan Security Pact. Anyone who knows anything about 20th century history will be able to read these directly. And you will be mostly right. The purpose of this game is not to confuse you about its world. In fact, it goes way out of its way to make sure you are not confused about this world. There is an entire in-game wiki, the Codex, that gives you ludicrous amounts of information about all this stuff. So you could just play Suzerain without reading any of this, and just play it as a dialogue game. I make some choices, click, 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 and you will reach an ending, and it will be interesting. You don't have to go and learn lots about this world. But if you want to, you can read about its history, its geography, the political ideologies, movements, figures. If you want to know who a person is, you can look up their entry in the Codex, and it'll give you a Wikipedia entry. Where did they go to school? What do they believe? What do they participate in? What kind of a person are they? And very much, you know, factual information. But this then makes the link to the way in which history is used to understand politics, and you know, politics very broadly in the present. You do the learning about the past, and it tells you something relevant about the present and the future. And this functions as a kind of hint guide. You're wondering, like, am I going to be overthrown? Well, okay, has anyone else been overthrown? Under what circumstances were they overthrown? And you will note the history of Swordland is actually full of instances where people have been overthrown in one way or another through a revolution or a coup or whatever. Will that happen to you? Maybe, maybe not, but it gives you a sense of why that might happen, when that might happen, who might be involved in it. Was somebody involved in a coup before? You at the very least know that that's the kind of thing they might do. Not to say the game doesn't have surprises, but it is very fair about providing you the information that you will need to know in order to understand its world. They've also gone, and clearly somebody did this with a lot of love, they've built a country and a culture underneath that country, and its minorities, its religions, its cuisine, its poetry, the character of Bernard Circus, where a lot of Act 1 revolves around this character, who is based on an actual Nasim Hikmet Ran, a Turkish poet with very similar views, and they even created snippets of the Swordish language. And one thing that gets repeated quite a lot throughout the game is there's this sort of, I guess, soft nationalist call and response phrase. This isn't hard nationalism. They also have that. If you ever say Gressi Swordland, that's a very different thing. But you say a Morgna West Cora, Vectrin Sista. A Morgna West Cora, the morning will come, Vectrin Sista. Victory is close. And that's like a thing that it's clearly, you can make that a big part of your political identity, or you can never say it. But other people will say it to you, or it will make reference to it. They've just gone out of their way to define all this stuff. in terms of mechanics, Swordland is not an autocracy, nor is it a super, super unstable coalition country where who knows what the case is, as in Chimerica. This is a parliamentary democracy, and if you want to affect any kind of change, you need to command a majority in the assembly, which is great. You start with one of those, so, you know, nice. But also, your party has multiple wings, and there are opposition parties to both the left and the right, and a few independents, and you can very easily lose the support even of your own party if you make choices that they don't like. And again, something that has happened previously in Swordland's history, so if you read the history, you know there have been previous failed presidents who, in one way or another, screwed things up. You can also screw things up. You also, of course, have your three political parties, not so different from Chimerica, the United Swordland Party, which you are the head of. This is Big Tent, is Solist. I'll get to Tarquin Sol in a moment. They're statists. The state has a very big role in the country at the beginning, again, very much like Turkey, and there are rightist and leftist elements. It's a very unaligned party in that sense, a kind of nationalist Big Tent. And then there's the PFJP on the left, that is liberal, they care about human rights. They have both right and left-wing elements in terms of economics. And then there's the National Front Party. And these are the people who think that democracy was probably just a mistake to begin with. Rah-rah, our ethnic group. Rah-rah, our country. Stick it to everyone else. And you do need a majority in the assembly, and also to be able to convince the Supreme Court in order to do anything, especially big, important things, like reform the Constitution, which may be something you want to do. But you don't need a specific majority. You can just hold on to your own party and do things that benefit your party and hope that gets you through. Or you can try to tack right or tack left, or you can try to be fabulously corrupt and bribe lots of people, or make the key allies that will sway particular members of the court, or just be wildly popular. Everyone loves me, you don't dare vote against me because everyone loves me. All those things will bring you some votes and not others. If you are able to command a majority, you can change quite a lot. If you can't, you can change very little. That's partly how parliamentary politics works. They also do a really excellent job of making their world legible. And here is, I think, something that they do better than Hidden Agenda, a real improvement. Rather than just having each person represent an interest group, you know, there's one bishop, there's one IMF representative, there's one army colonel. Instead, what you get are multiple people who represent different views on the same sort of topic. And sometimes those people will have common interests, and sometimes they will have divergent interests. So here are three examples, and I love the portraits in this game. There's the Eggman, Josef Lancea, and Valken Kruger. Both military guys. You know, if you fund the military and support the military, they'll both be very happy with you. If you defund the military and throw up your hands and declare yourself a pacifist, they will both hate you. But they have different agendas for the military. Josef really, really wants modernization. He wants a smaller professional army that is well-equipped and modern, and that relies on speed and international alliances to make this work. And Valken Kruger has a very traditional, we have powerful enemies, we need a large army, we must be able to stand on our own 2 feet. All this modernization stuff is, you know, great if you give us more money, but let's be clear, power. Or Nia Morgna or Lilias Graf. Note Morgna, morning. She's all about, we need to improve our judicial system, we need to have fair, transparent, effective justice. Lilias Graf, we have riots, we need to suppress them. We need to maintain stability, we need to make sure that this country does not go up in flames, as it has multiple times over the last half-century. It's one of the things that's nice about Swordish history. The talk of things like revolution and unrest are not abstract. Everyone here has lived through these things. You've lived through these things. They are not hypothetical. Peter Vectren and Lucien Galad. You meet them right near the beginning. Peter Vectren's your best friend and vice president. Vectren, victory. Peter Vectren loves whatever it is you want to do. He's on your side, like 100% at least at the beginning. And he's very friendly, he's very personalist. Whatever Rain wants, Rain can achieve. He has no doubts that you are the guy. Lucien is exactly the opposite. He is strategic and tactical. We must do what is strategic, what is popular, what solidifies our position, what keeps votes, what gets votes. Doesn't matter what we want to achieve, we need to focus on the path of getting there. And both of these people will bend, although not limitlessly, to whatever it is you want to do, but they focus on very different ways of getting there, and by creating these oppositions, we get a super legible sense of what this world looks like, what your possibilities are, what you might or might not do. It's super easy to relate to. Not everything is set up exactly that neatly, but the last thing I want to talk about with Suzerain is something I find extremely interesting, and I'm very sad that that got cut off there, because that would be a nice thing to read. This gentleman is named Tarquin Sol, and this is probably the most important person in the history of Swordland. And at the beginning of the game, he is in the prologue. He's one of the characters you interact with very briefly in your early political career. He can either be sort of a patron to you, or you can be a bit of an opposition figure to him, although very junior. His influence in this game is enormous, and the interpretation of who he is and what he means and how you're going to relate to him forms a lot of your political career. And so the question then is, who is Tarquin Sol? One thing is he's probably veteran character actor James Cosmo. That's obviously the picture that was reference art was used for very clearly. That's a Georg Mormont from Game of Thrones, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. Yes, obviously he's this guy, but that's not interesting from our perspective. That's just character art, although, authority, skepticism, takes no shit. This, there are things you can read into the guy's face that I think are pretty relevant here. In the game, Tarquin Sol he's the charismatic colonel. He was a war hero, and specifically, he was the victor in a civil war that happened earlier in the century. There was a republic, very briefly, but was overthrown by a right-wing coup, which then provoked a left-wing counter-coup, and the two fought and fought and fought, until eventually Tarquin Sol came out on top, being aligned with neither party, fought the left, betrayed the right, purged the left, and created a national state kind of in his image. He created a republic that he wanted. And he creates a secular state, a national state based on swordish identity. A cult of personality is created around him. To some extent, he created it. To other extents, other people created it for him. But it's very much associated with him. He's the kind of person whose portrait will be in every classroom. That sort of thing. He founds the United Swordland Party, which is your party. It's the Big Tent Party, and it's part of the reason why it exists as this Big Tent thing. That it's associated with this guy. And an ideology forms around his ideas. He is a nationalist, he is a statist, and he is not aligned politically. Swordland stands alone, the state will protect you, government intervention is great because it means we, the adults, are in charge. That's what he is in the context of the game. But of course, this is a game that is based in Turkey. And again, part of the reason why I say this is definitely based in Turkey is this. This is Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the equivalent hero for Turkey. Again, a war hero from World War I and the chaos that followed it. He restores order to Turkey after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He establishes the secular national state of Turkey, based around Turkish identity and not religious identity or imperial identity. a cult of personality forms around him. He forms the Republican People's Party, which is, again, a big nationalist, statist, big tent political party, and he is all of those things, and an ideology forms around him, his ideas, and the cult of personality around him, which is Kemalism. So maybe we just say this guy is Ataturk. Well, this guy's Ataturk, obviously, but we say Saul is Ataturk. He's just a straight XP. That's not a bad answer, but there are a couple of things that trouble us there. One is, gosh, a lot of countries have a figure exactly like this. And see if I can remember them all here. From left to right, Juan Perón from Argentina, very similar kind of story. That's weirdly similar name. Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt. That's Suharto from Indonesia. That's Charles de Gaulle from France. That is Getulio Vargas from Brazil. And that is Francisco Franco from Spain. All of these people have different stories. They don't fit quite as neatly. But this idea of the legendary strongman who wins the war and establishes the role of the state and becomes this kind of national myth, one of the most common reactions that people have to playing Suzerain from the first time, especially people from developing countries, is, gosh, this sounds an awful lot like the history of my country. I think this must be based on it. And I don't think they're necessarily wrong. These are all the stories that rhyme with the story of Ataturk and of Turkey, and they are, to some extent, based on these characters. Bits and pieces of them show up in this story. So that's one other example, is that Tarquin Sol is not just Ataturk. He is a instantiation of an archetype that exists in a lot of countries and a lot of places. There's also this guy, Kenan Evren. And you'll note the portrait of Ataturk in the background. This is a later president of Turkey. He led a coup in 1980. He established a super restrictive, stabilizing, but highly undemocratic constitution. He is a centrist authoritarian who suppressed dissent famously on both left and right, banned youth groups. He was a Kemalist. He followed in that ostensible tradition, although Kemalism is fuzzy enough that that could mean almost anything. He is famous for his Turkish nationalism and especially his anti-Kurdish oppression, the rather gross state view that there's no such thing as a Kurd, there are only mountain Turks, very much associated with his rule. Linked to and some of this verges in conspiracy theory, but some of it is clearly real, linked to anti-democratic deep state ideas, that there are actors embedded within this state who don't really so much care who gets elected or democracy, this, that, or the other. They are there to ensure particular policies remain in place, especially ones favorable to the military. And he is someone who is, long after the end of his term in office, was tried and convicted for his role in the coup, in oppression, and so on. And I don't think it is coincidental that this story here of his trial and conviction in 2014 happens just before Suzerain starts getting made. This was clearly something that was current events for the developers of Suzerain. And I don't want to go too far into spoiler alert here, but there are elements of Tarquin Sol's rule that are not just extremely happy, he did a wonderful thing for our country, what a great guy. And one of the things that can happen in the game is that you pursue the question of, do we need to undo his state? Do we need to account for instance, his historical crimes against minorities? In Suzerain, there is a Sordish majority in your country. There are also ethnic minorities, notably the Bludish, who are, again, this is obviously Turkey, a ethnic group that has a slightly different religious and cultural values, who exist across multiple countries in the region, and who are oppressed, but also in various ways fighting back. They have political parties and also a militant wing that is suppressed but maybe still exists. It's not just the Kurds. You could also read that as Basques or Tamils. or Scots, or French Canadians. All sorts of countries have this sort of situation with some kind of minority that has this dynamic. But I think the Turks and Kurds is the base model here, and if we interpret Saul as Kenan Evren, that looks very different than interpreting Saul as Ataturk. Ataturk does not have an unambiguously good legacy, but there is something maybe that one might be a bit more proud of than this guy who maybe not so much. On the other hand, he himself certainly did make the argument that what he did was necessary for stability. There was chaos, people were dying, I stopped it. And you will be confronted with these kinds of arguments throughout not only the past of Swordland, but also its present and future. The other one, of course, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome. Tarquin Saul's first name is Tarquin, and if you have any classics, you will associate him with this guy. A quasi-legendary figure, but the last king of Rome before being replaced by the Roman Republic, which sets up a kind of classical analogy. How do you follow on from your tyrannical predecessor, maybe? Do you say, yes, he had a great idea, I want to follow in his footsteps? Do you say, no, he was wrong, I want to reform the country? Or do you go even further and say, the problem with him was not just that he did the thing, but he didn't go far enough? And all of these are possible options in Suzerain, and again, all implied somehow by this character, who is not just James Cosmo, and he's not just Ataturk, but the question of how do you deal with the legacy of historical figures, and what does that mean for the present. I think Suzerain deals really well with that. So, up till now, we've been talking about countries that have a lot more realism, shall we say. Both Swordland and Chimerica don't exist, but they kind of plausibly could exist. We're going to venture into slightly different territory now. We're also leaving aside the territory of fully formed political actors, where you start playing them the moment they become president or prime minister or whatever of a country, as adults, although you do get some influence in Anton Rain's past. That takes all of 5 minutes, and the rest of the game, he is an adult. But of course, politics is something that is actually part of a life process, and family and community and growing up are political things, and they shape who we are, and they can be a fundamental part of what we become. And there are 3 games I'm going to talk briefly about that engage more directly with this process, and also help make some sort of links to other genres that maybe are complementary, I think, that add some kind of elements derived from role-playing games, and other sources of what I think of as generally useful branching out. So the first one of these is actually a game from the Dark Ages, from 2012, when very few games in this space were being made, and you wouldn't have expected this game to be one of them, but it is. Published by Hanako Games. I like Hanako Games, but I think this is their best work. It is a sort of quasi-medieval setting, in the way that any, there are castles and kings and armies and so on, and holy smokes are there magical girl tropes. I hope that's fairly obvious. There is a strong anime sort of, you get to play as a sort of Sailor Moon-esque character in some way, which might lead you to think that this is a Princess Maker game. There are Princess Maker games, literally the game called Princess Maker and its sequels, a compelling genre in some ways, although also some slightly weird tropes that are hard to process, but where you raise a kid, and you teach them certain things, and you dress them up, and they accomplish stuff, and hooray, you're a great parent. This looks like it's there, and it kind of is. It shares some strong similarities with this genre, but it is fundamentally different. You are not Elodie's father. You are Elodie, the crown princess of Nova, soon to be queen. You are the de facto ruler of this state, of Nova, technically your father is regent, although the first thing you learn in the game is that your father is a wet blanket and totally useless. Very little in the game challenges that you are in charge. You make the high-stakes decisions about politics and about your own development. You are raising yourself in some way. And while doing it, you are running the country, which is a delicate balance. So Long Live the Queen is much closer to Hidden Agenda than it is to Volcano Princess. Elodie's death is by far the most outcome in this game, hence the ironic title, Long Live the Queen. There are 11 distinct ways to die, some of which are quite hard to find. And one way to play through this game is to try to find them all, which is actually a really entertaining process. But the reason why she has lots of ways to die is that Nova is a complex and hazardous political environment. You face challenges that are external, that is to say countries or neighbors that want to do you harm or invade you or overthrow you. You face internal intrigues, people who perhaps want what is best for you but also have very particular ideas about what that is, or people who do not want what's best for you but are being deceptive about that. You face class-based unrest. There is a nobility and a peasantry, and they do not agree about many things, and if you piss one or the other group off too badly, they will not be very happy with you. There are magical enemies. This is, again, a fantasy world. All sorts of things that can kill you. And you start this game young and inexperienced. You are 14, and you can do very, very little except complain. But you can learn. Everybody wants something from you. Some people want to kill you, some people want to persuade you, or protect you, or groom you, or manipulate you, or marry you, or corrupt you. You are the focus of power, but you also don't, at the beginning, have a lot of power for yourself. And if you want to do things, you must figure out how to do it. And here then we get the fusion with the princess maker genre. Her education determines what she can do. And she determines for herself what she wants to train in, to learn. This is part of, and this does look like the training of nobility in some ways. They have tutors, they have resources, they learn particular things in childhood. If you want to train monarchs and aristocrats, this is not a bad abstraction. Every 10 points, Elodie learns something new. It's actually super cool. It's a specific thing. It says what you practiced doing, and the game is actually really quite faithful to this. If you practiced doing something, you will be able to do that thing in the real world, and not otherwise. It's not just you have lots of stats, that's great. And there are also some economies of scale. The better you are at a particular thing, the faster you develop at those things. So going from 0 to something is quite hard, but going from something to max is not so hard. But the more you specialize, the more weaknesses you have. The more stuff you can't do. And that might turn out to be very important. Long Live the Queen is a long series of skill checks. There are an enormous number of skill checks in this game. Some of these are passive, they just happen. On this week, there will be a skill check that checks, do you have this skill or not? And it will tell you that. And it will just tell you, did you succeed or fail? Some of them are passive, and some of them are active. You pick something and it actively checks. You tried to kill someone with a sword. How good are you with a sword? If the answer is rubbish, then you're probably not going to survive that. You cannot pass all of them. You cannot even pass most of them. The objective of this game is not to pass every skill check. No way, no how. It's usually very transparent about this. Not literally 100% of the time, but mostly. It tells you if you succeeded or failed, although it does not tell you by how much if you fail. It just tells you you failed. If you succeed, it does tell you why you succeeded, although again, you should be able to tell, because the skill will be specific. You learned this particular piece of intrigue, and therefore you were able to use that piece of intrigue. There are usually multiple ways to overcome most problems, although not all of them, representing different ways of solving a problem. You may, for instance, be faced with a situation where you have to dance. And if you are a great dancer, then fantastic. But then also, if you have tremendous composure, maybe you can't dance, but at least you don't get massively embarrassed at not being able to dance, and it goes fine. Or something else. All sorts of alternate ways or partial ways of dealing with things. Usually failing checks is bad, although again, you fail lots of checks. And sometimes they're lethal, which is why this game will probably kill you. especially on the first playthrough. This game, maybe more than others, is really designed to be played multiple times. I think Emily Short suggested took her 14 goes around. That's probably more than it will take most people, but it's not impossible. You die a lot. Lots of things will kill you. There's also another set of mechanics. Elodie has a mood. Yeah, she's a teenager, and things affect how she feels. She is under an enormous amount of stress. An enormous amount of stress. And the game is tracking, how angry are you, how afraid are you? And those two trade off against each other. How cheerful are you, how depressed are you? Those things trade off against each other. How willful or yielding, how pressured or lonely. These determine your mood. Whichever is highest and furthest to the left tells you what mood you're in. In this case, depressed 4 means you're depressed. If you are, for instance, angry, you will be good at learning particular skills that fit with that. You will learn how to fight with swords or bows, or learn how to organize military strategy well, but you will not be so good at learning artistic skills, how to paint or sing. You will not be good at royal demeanor. That is to say, you want to be a queen and be able to present yourself as a queen. You're not very good at that when you're angry, and if you try to train those skills, you will get less out of it. Which sounds very simple then, right? It's just a maximization problem. Get the most stats. Hooray! We've left the genre of tense political choices and have entered into a much more comprehensible Princess Maker genre. No. The game actually, in one of these integrated tutorial moments, gives you a really great thing early on. You start the game depressed. Your mother has just died, you've been called back from school, life sucks for you. And that's great for developing artistic skills and also your relationship for animal skills, but bad for a bunch of other things, including royal demeanor. If you want to learn how to be a ruler, you are in no mood for doing that early on. But very early on, there is a check on your composure that has a plot-relevant event attached to it. Minor spoilers. And the composure 10 is, you practice deep breathing exercises, learning to find and maintain a sense of inner calm. That's what you can do when you have 10 composure. And if you can't do that, you can't do that. And if what you were doing was trying to get the most stats, a big bucket of stats, fill it up as quickly as possible, you would never train composure in week 1 or week 2 because you only get half the stats from it. You get a penalty to it. That's an incredibly inefficient way to get a big bucket of stats. But this is actually quite an important thing that happens. And upon multiple replays, you start to understand how that is important, but at the very least, this teaches you the important thing is having the right skills at the right time. It's not whether you have lots of stats, it's whether or not you are able to overcome the challenges that are presented to you based on what you want to do and what everyone else wants to do to you. And that's politics. Learning to dance adequately before the grand ball is better than learning to dance elegantly after the grand ball. It is not just checking at the end of the game how many stats do you have. It's a process in time. And so timing matters. And does this fit with history? Well, yeah. I think of Peter I, called the Great, although he was a hyper-competent sadist, so make of that what you will. He's a weird dude. But when he was 7, his sister decided she'd rather rule in his name. There's an uprising by the palace guard, the Streltsy, and Peter the Great is effectively sent into internal exile. They don't kill him. They probably can't kill him, it's unclear, because they're ruling in his name, but he is super sidelined. Go be a kid, do whatever, we rule Muscovy. And Peter's childhood is somewhat famous, but he was a very ambitious kid and had, as Tsar of all Russias, enormous resources to play with, and so learned war games. He had fabulous tutors whose names still grace major fortifications and cities and so on in Russia. They played war games with real troops and live ammunition. He learned shipbuilding, he learned mathematics, he learned navigation. He established 2 toy regiments who would have fights against each other as part of his childhood games. And those became the Preobrazhensky and Semenovsky regiments, which were they were the most important regiments in the Russian army until the revolution. And he then goes on to modernize the Russian state, he builds a navy, he tours Europe, he learned shipbuilding, he found St. Petersburg, etc., etc. he is learning these skills from very early on, and the fact that he did so is really critical to the history of Russia. I mean, this is an absolutely pivotal figure, and if he hadn't done those things, and had instead devoted himself to becoming a learned and pious young man, which would have been very acceptable, I'm sure his sister would have been very happy with that had he just memorized religious text, the history of Russia would be very different, I think. Or at least his role in it would be very different. So, we learn things from history that we can apply to games, and to some extent they mirror. Next game I want to talk about, speaking of Russia, we transition to a game by a Russian developer. This comes just after Suzerain, The Life and Suffering of Sir Brante, the sort of intense title that tells you a lot about this. There's obviously a lot of Russian literary influence in this game. It's intense, it's very dark, it's fatalistic, there are strong religious elements here, and it has this lovely early modern woodcut aesthetic, and has a sort of, you're reading a book page by page from the end of your life framing device. Super cool game. Again, dark. This is also in a fantasy world. It's like The Life and Suffering of Sir Brante in the Last Days of the Blessed Arcanian Empire, I think is the full title. So there's magic. There are fantasy races, the Arcanians, who are the sort of nobility of this empire. There are gods, the twins, they are real. And there is a reincarnation mechanic that is a replay mechanic. So up till now, we've not had a game that hasn't an explicit mechanical instantiation of replays. Long Live the Queen obviously expects you to replay it. Obviously. But this game actually says, no, like, you will redo your life. In this life, what will be important to you? Family, ambition, yourself, money. And this is a society that has some analogies with the real world. You are born, or most people are born into one of three lots. That is literally your lot in life. The nobility, the priests, and the lotless, the commoners. Weirdly, the lotless is also a lot, but anyway, never mind. And we'll get to what that reminds us of in a moment. The Blessed Arcanian Empire is very powerful, it's very old, it's very feudal, but it's also super unstable. And you get hints of this as you are playing this game. And the game is very explicit. There is a revolt coming. You know this, because it's built into the meta presentation of the game. And how you participate in this determines your fate, and also the fate of the Empire. It is organized into 5 chapters, which fits roughly the 3-act play, the first 3 chapters kind of being the first act, and then 2 and 3. And you know what this timeline is from the beginning. You will have a childhood, you will have a youth, you'll have an adolescence, there will be a time of peace, and then there will be the revolt. And you can see this. There's a timeline built in. So you know something is happening and going to happen. And Life of Suffering of Sir Brante breaks opacity a little bit. It makes some of the mechanics explicit, although it does this in a really delicious way that works and preserves the tension really well. Remarkable that they manage it. Your childhood is kind of your prologue. You determine, what kind of a person am I? What is my relationship with my family, with my siblings, with my parents, with my uncle who really wants me to be noble and ambitious for the family? And unlike most people in this world, you have a chance to alter your lot in life. If you are clever, you can end up in the priesthood, and thus end up in that lot. If you are not, you probably end up lotless, and there are some bold, ambitious choices you can do that are sort of portrayed as legally or religiously questionable, but that will allow you to embrace nobility and demand that a particular view of your family be accepted, and you are noble. And from that moment on, that is your lot. And you set out all of these things about Sir Brante. This is a game about growing up. The political Bildungsroman. This is about the process of growing up in a world that is explicitly political. And this is the first game that really does that. From there, the game branches out. You have the 3 lots, and then the question of what is your relationship to the revolution? You end up with roughly 6 paths by the end. And the game does some really interesting things with this and makes some political statements, I think. One of the things they do that's kind of cool is they lay out a bunch of things that are possible in this chapter at the beginning of the chapter. And sometimes they're really tantalizing, and sometimes they're really mysterious. Like, what does it mean that this thing would happen? Oh, if I get 3 of this quality, this will trigger. You can play the game with those things hidden or revealed. Interestingly, it works pretty well either way, which is sort of a violation of the rules I set out above, but it does this in this really lovely playing with the player way that I really enjoy. The game tracks personal variables and social variables. There are things like, how much willpower do you have? Are you how good are you at social things, at intellectual things, at physical things? And you need to have certain levels of those skills in order to overcome challenges, but it's also tracking social variables. And one of the things it does is there is almost always a negative consequence for some of the main variables getting too high or too low. If you are affiliating yourself with a particular faction, doing things that benefit that faction will probably raise that faction's power. And that's good for you up to a point. But if a faction becomes very powerful, then they will do whatever the heck they want, unbalanced by anyone else, by their rivals. And that will probably be bad for you. Probably, not always. And this has a very particular view of politics. Yes, that somehow balance is important, or at the very least that people with unchecked power will do things that you really might not want them to do, but you didn't check their power, so they can do them, and you will suffer the consequences, probably. And so the life and suffering of Sir Brante ends up being this really interesting game of trying to advance your personal agenda, what it is you want for Sir Brante or his family or the world, while also balancing out your relationship with all of these other forces. Remembering that this is a time of change, and a lot of people are doing things that they might not otherwise be able to do, but who is going to stop them? And thus we get to the clear historical analogy here that this is the age of revolutions. I've thrown here the French Revolution. This looks like a lot of revolutions. Again, the history rhymes, right? There are lots of things that this rhymes with. But the Arcadian Empire is very clearly a stand-in for the Ancien Regime, and the revolt is very clearly a stand-in for the French Revolution. There is both a possibility and a necessity of reform. Things are going badly. Tensions are building, underlying forces are changing, ideas that used to be fixed, maybe for a very long time, are suddenly malleable. What role will you play in that? Will you promote new ideas or persecute them? Will you adopt them, or will you pretend to adopt them for personal gain? And as control slips, things descend into chaos. What do? Do you try to reestablish control, or maintain order, or save who you can, or chaos is a ladder, let's climb as high as we can? And you have the 3 estates, your clergy, nobility, and commoners, as from the French political system. And the underlying message really seems to be that individuals can remake themselves and the world, but there's always risk, and there's always a cost. This is a very dark, fatalistic view. You can accomplish things, but man, oh man, can you not just accomplish whatever you want to. Things seldom go entirely right, but they can go extremely wrong. This has this is the sort of political flavor. Which takes us to our last game, with an extremely different flavor. This is a game called I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, 2022, fairly recent, by a couple of Canadian developers, Sarah and Colin Northway. This game is adorably left-wing. It really wears its heart on its sleeve. It's very obvious to see its social and cultural leanings. I really like. I mean, not to say that
the life and suffering of Sir Brante doesn't. I think it's very clear that it does. But that this is very much a different image about what is true and what is possible. It has pastel colors, it has this soft cartoon aesthetic, it is utopian, it discusses environmental themes, tolerance themes, identity themes, and maybe more than the other games, it is politically activist. It is more clear which are the right and wrong endings than in the other games. It isn't super sledgehammery about that. You can still do the thing that it's very clear the developers do not think would be a good idea and stand by it and say, no, this is how it is. But it is maybe slightly judgier than maybe Suzerain might be about that. You play as Saul, or many variations of Saul. You can name yourself the child of Flulu and Germanium, and you are part of a small commune of ideological idealists who crash land on the planet of Vertumna. You are going there as a kind of get away from a decaying Earth colonization project, but you don't quite make it as you intended, you crash. So you have to try and survive and thrive. And this is a very explicitly radical context. You're in a small group with very particular ideas about politics. They are, roughly speaking, sort of communalist left-wing ideas, and this puts us more in the space of something like Ursula K. Le Guin or Kim Stanley Robinson. You're trying to instantiate something marvelous, despite a world that maybe doesn't want you to do that, but you have to grow and learn and become better people in order to do that. And they have really, really covered their bases diversity-wise. They have characters that fit into just about every bucket that would have been regularly identified when the game was made, which is fairly recently, and it is a game where you can literally change your gender presentation and pronouns just by a slider at any time you want to. No consequences whatsoever. The game never makes that a problem for you. Everyone just accepts that, which is, it's a choice, and it's pretty cool. I don't mean to say other choices would not have other cool consequences, but man, do they really go there in this sense. It does have some similar mechanics to both Long Live the Queen and Life and Suffering. You train skills, you organize your time, you contribute to the colony in the way you want to, and that changes as you grow up. And it is a game about growing up. Very much like Life and Suffering, the plot is organized by, you start out when you're 10 and you end when you're 19. And your capabilities when you're 18 or 19 are very, very different than your capabilities when you're 10 or 11. And the game builds that in. Nevertheless, when you are 10 or 11, you are deciding what kind of person are you and are you becoming, and what effect is that going to have on the world? Because you do have a very strong deterministic or determining power. The way you overcome challenges in the game is by winning at this card game. And your cards in this card game represent memories of your life. And it starts with childhood memories of being curious, of being brave, of figuring out something for the first time. And as you gain new memories in the game, you do different new things, those memories become a part of you. And usually more powerful, more helpful parts of you. You can also forget old memories in some ways. And not all memories are beneficial. Some of them are harmful or traumatic or just plain useless. And specialization. If you become the kind of person that gets certain kind of memories, you become more capable in those ways and maybe less capable in others. Which takes us to an interesting point here. I told you that randomness is not a part of this genre, and here's some randomness. So what the hell? Am I just lying to you? And I think this still qualifies for a few reasons. First, it is a stretch. It is a shifting of the boundaries of this genre. However, you can just shut it off. You can play this game and just succeed at all the challenges. There's a button to do that. And the game still works perfectly well. I don't think it is as good, but so the game must be able to absorb that. And there is a best hand button, which is a little bit of a trap, but the game helps you out a lot here. This is not Slay the Spire. This is something much more like Long Live the Queen, although far less lethal than Long Live the Queen. You can die, but this is not a game that kills you regularly. It's more like Suzerain. And the important thing is that your capacity in the present still reflects your past choices in a way that feels real. And the sense that I can do this and not that, but had I made different choices in the past, it might be the other way around. And that's the important part, I think, for preserving this genre, and I think Teenage Exocolonist is still there. Another thing this game does, again, part of the genres, the visual novel genres it is sort of adjacent to or engaging with, there are friendship mechanics in this game. I mean, Suzerain, for instance, is tracking your relationship with people, but there are no Harvest Moon or Stardew Valley style friendship mechanics. You don't give Joseph Lancea a gift and he goes, "Thank you for giving me a gift." That's not how it works. It is how it works in Teenage Exocolonist. You talk to people, you remember their birthday, you learn their birthday. You don't know at the beginning. You have to figure that out, which is an interesting mechanic. And very much like in Suzerain, your cast of characters represent different functions in society and political views. Anemone there is a warrior. She is very interested in defending this colony and making sure it is safe. And Tang there is a scientist. She discovers things. That's what she does. And Cal, big strong guy there, is a farmer, and he's kind of a sweetie and a pacifist, but he grows crops, And they also then reflect those elements of society. So even here, the characters also serve this political function thing, although they are not representative of interest groups. This is a tiny group of people, and they do have their own personalities, and so on. You are in an unknown world in a way that is very different from previous games we've talked about. The other games are quite legible because they have real-world analogies. This does have real-world analogies. We'll talk about those in a moment, but you're in Vertumna. Vertumna is big, it's colorful, it's dangerous, and you don't really know what is up with it. It is alien. You are somewhere where you don't know the shape of the world you are in, at least not in depth. And one of the things you can do, and the game strongly encourages you to do, at least to some extent, is to explore. When you're very young, that means sneaking out. When you're older, that means going out on research trips, or foraging trips, or hunting trips. And you get to see this world you're in, and that creates uncertainty and danger and so on. And it also shows how you and your colony fit into this larger ecosystem and world by learning bits about it and unraveling secrets. And that is a different thing, but also fits with a lot of the ecological themes, for instance, right? Your place in this world and your species' place in this world is not fixed. What is it going to be? And once you've seen more of this world and come to understand things about it, you still have to deal with the politics of the people who haven't seen that, or who don't know that, or who have different views of that. And that's interesting. Does that have a historical analogy? Well, yes. We have settler colonialism in this real world, where groups of people have moved somewhere else, usually where there are other people, and settled there. And they encounter new cultures, new flora, new fauna, new context, and I was a teenage exocolonist, I don't think it is too strong to say, is a critique of colonialism, at least mostly. Again, adorably left-wing. Colonialism is a conflict-ridden and morally dubious project. You are doing something where it might be good for you, but might be a bad thing overall. You might be harming people who you don't even understand or know about. And the question then is, well, what is your role as a person growing up in this society? And again, you're too young. You never lived on Earth. You were born on the ship, or at least you were like 1 or something. You do not have any memory of that. Your true place is Vertumna. But what kind of a person you are there, and what role you will have, and what role you will play in the development of this colony and social change is all part of this game. And settler colonialism has created some pretty horrifying things, but it has also been, at least in some ways, a spur for rethinking ideas of society. New things are possible. What are those new things? Sometimes good ideas, frequently enough terrible ideas. but that we do have a historical analogy here, and I think Exocolonist does engage quite directly with those. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk about a couple of things before I leave and we all go to the pub. Number one is these games deal with some super dark themes. Like really dark. Like really, really, really dark. You can do horrible things. You can do things that would not be too strong to label as atrocities. Like, you should be on trial in The Hague atrocities. And they are enabled by these systems, and they're not just simulationist emergent things. You can't just do them because, you know, you played the sandbox and somehow this became possible. They wrote these scenarios into the game. So why would they do that? And this creates like real world problems. In some sense, I put validation in quotation marks here because I don't mean to like beat up on the developers, but if you put an extreme choice into the game and treat it kind of like every other choice, it leads to outcomes. You can do it. Some people will take that as validation. And one of the worst things about the existence of Suzerain is the way that there are some people who glom on to some aspects of this game and are like, great, I can oppress minorities, hooray! And it's unclear to what extent they're role-playing this idea versus they're 14 trolling versus whatever, they're actually horrible racist people, but these are real people, and they exist, and they say things, and is that okay? How do we react to that? And there are different ways you can answer this. I don't mean to say either of these is a definitive answer. One answer is that atrocities are real-world political outcomes. History of humanity is terrifying. I'm in the business. It's we're not a great species overall, and we've done some pretty horrible things. And if you want to imagine the whole political space that has happened in the world and could happen again, these are things that have happened and I dare say will happen again. And if you delete these elements in order to create something more sanitized, that has consequences. And I think the model here is Sid Meier's Colonization. The Digital Antiquarian has a really good essay on colonization. Like, what does it mean that they made an entire game about the colonization of the Americas that deletes chattel slavery? Like, this is one of the fundamental facts about this whole process. It's not the only fundamental fact, but you end up with something really weirdly bowdlerized. These things exist whether you engage with them or not, and people will be reminded of them. The other is, of course, that the choice to be moral doesn't make any sense without the choice to be immoral. And there are some games that I really love, Citizen Sleeper, for instance, where you observe a whole bunch of horrible, oppressive things happening based on the social system you're in and so on and so forth, but you don't really have any, like, you don't really define your relationship to them all that well. You have a little bit of play around the edges, but mostly they just happen to you. But that's not really a moral choice. In order to choose something different, there has to be the possibility of choosing the other thing. And Citizen Sleeper does a little bit of that, but mostly the strength of the other choices, the non-horrifying choices, is a product of the fact that you could have chosen differently, and the game would acknowledge those consequences, and that would be a thing that happens. And it's quite horrifying. So, just to wrap up, every game here creates some kind of world model. And when you create a world model, you at least implicitly say something about what's possible in the world, because you create things that are possible in the world model. You are making a thesis somehow about society, about politics, about how we come together and make decisions. Obviously, this doesn't tell us anything about the real world directly. Suzerain is not historical fact. It is not a political science textbook. It never will be. But you explore the possibility space, and that gives you an imaginative primer to thinking through political decisions and their constraints. And then, when you put it all together, something kind of emerges at the end, a kind of thesis or something. And Hidden Agenda is saying something like, politics is difficult, it's high stakes, it's ruthless, and people will pursue their interests, even your allies, in ways that might be extremely inconvenient and might lead to horrible outcomes. This is the reality of politics. If you want to do politics, you have to deal with that. Suzerain tells us, if you want to change the game of politics, you have to change the rules of the game. But if you want to change the rules of the game, you need to play the game and win. today's power relations constrain what might be possible tomorrow. And if you don't deal with that, well, you might be playing something, but you're probably not playing politics. Long Live the Queen tells us that monarchs must be competent, stable, and well-informed, and that individual decision makers are super vulnerable in lots of ways, both physically, mentally, emotionally, and that maybe makes monarchy a terrible system. Or at the very least, we need to think about those things if we want a monarchy. I don't want a monarchy. Life and Suffering of Sir Brante tells us, in this very fatalistic, intense, dare I say, Russian way, status quo might be bad, but what follows might be worse. And that anything to excess is probably very dangerous, even if it's the thing that you want, even if it's your goal. And Teenage Exocolonist tells us lots of things. Things can look very different if you take the time to explore with an open mind. Knowing things about the world in which you are in and taking the time to understand them deeply changes your view and maybe changes what you should do. And also, idealism isn't enough. You need to be brave, you need to be smart, and you need to make friends if you want to change the world. A very idealistic message for a very idealistic game. So, I've now taken a whopping 3 minutes beyond the hour, but thank you for bearing with me and listening.